Well, I want to welcome you all who have joined us for our webinar tonight. My name is Tim Cole, and I work with Waypoint Church Partners, and we're glad that you're joining us. Waypoint exists to catalyze kingdom growth, and we do that by planting dynamic new churches that are laser focused on the Great Commission, but we also do that by not only planting new churches, but partnering with established churches to help them get on mission and stay on mission. And so we do that by providing training, coaching, consulting, and connecting with churches in our region. And so this is one of those opportunities that we have for several of those components for connecting you to other great leaders like Jim Estep that we've got with us tonight, but coaching and training is what we're getting here as well tonight. So this is a big part of that. We've been doing our webinars for almost 6 years as a result of an on-site event that we had with E2 elders in Richmond. Jim, I don't remember how many years ago that was in Mechanicsville, but
Yeah.
having breakfast in the hotel with Dr. Gary Johnson, we were talking about, man, we could do webinars, and so a couple hours later, he's standing in front of about 300 guys saying, and Waypoint's starting webinars next month. And he announced public that was the whole conversation. And so I was like, okay, we're starting webinars. So E2 elders are to blame for the fact that we're still here and doing webinars. So thank you for that. It's been a great resource for churches and leaders in our region to feel better equipped in their particular area of service to the church. Waypoint, we have three great values: that we love the church, the bride of Christ. We love lost people, the object of the Great Commission, and then we love our family of churches, the Restoration Movement. And so this is really serving the church because we love the bride of Christ. And so our Waypoint uh, 55 series is for any church leaders, and the topics rotate among 6 or 7 topics for different ministry areas, whether it's elders like and deacons tonight, but for prayer team leaders, mission team leaders, safety and security team leaders, and so on, mission team leaders, to help equip them to do their part so that the bride looks beautiful, and that's really our goal. And so we want to give, first of all, as always, props to Mid-Atlantic Christian University, who serves as our platform sponsor, that has been with us since the beginning, and we serve in a similar area, Mid-Atlantic region. And so we're glad that they're partnering with us to equip churches to do their best. I want to highlight, we do have a YouTube channel. If you search on Waypoint Church Partners, and all of our webinars are on there for the last 6 or so years, and they're organized by playlist to where you can see all the ones that are for elders and leaders in specific, or for prayer team leaders, mission team leaders, and so on. And so we would love for you to uh, forward those to the people in your church that are in those particular areas of ministry, to feel like they've got resourcing for their areas. Most of these areas, there's not a whole lot of resources out there at the local Christian bookstore or elsewhere to figure out how they can serve in their area of ministry better. And so if you would point them to those, that would be great. We do have an event coming up for elders and deacons and other leaders here in a couple of months on April the 6th, the Saturday morning in Mechanicsville, just outside of Richmond. And Bob Russell is going to be talking about navigating your church through turbulent waters. And there's also another one actually in near Fayetteville, North Carolina, 3 weeks later on April 27th. I don't have a slide for that, but if you go to the Waypoint uh, website, you'll see the link for that as well here. And so it's the same topic, but in different parts of our region. And so it's a great way, anytime you take a road trip, to bring your elders and leaders together, good things happen. When you get good people in the same room, good things happen. And so when you can get your elders and leaders together to talk about how we lead the church well together, that's huge. And so we want to invite you to bring your leaders to one of those events if you'd like, and to hear from one of the most respected leaders in our movement, Bob Russell,
Absolutely.
who's with Bob Russell Ministries now, of course, retired after nearly 4 decades at Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky. And so we're talking about elders and leaders, not just elders. Most of our topics so far with
Mhm.
our twice-a-year conversation has been about elders in specific. Many of those sessions have been with the guys from E2 Effective Elders, and for appropriate reasons, because they just have great stuff for churches and leaders trying to help equip their elders But the topic tonight is how elders and deacons can work together rather than
Mhm.
apart. And the word I would think of, Jim, here before we jump into your presentation, is to get your leaders aligned. And a lot of
Mhm.
times you have one big part running
Absolutely.
this way and one big part running slightly different. It's not like they're in opposite. Well, hopefully they're not in opposite directions. But I
We
think
hope.
about an automobile. If your car is out of line, they're just a few degrees off. And it may not be noticeable, but if you take your hands on the wheel and just let it coast, it'll start drifting way off. And sometimes it's really noticed to where it wears out quicker. And so the
That's
same
right.
is true for elders and deacons. If you think of those as two wheels on a car, is if they're not fully aligned, even just by a few degrees
Mhm.
off, you can keep the car going generally the right direction if you stick with it. But two things will happen. One, if you take your hands off the wheel and the church just coasts through a season, all of a sudden it can really veer off course. Or over time, the tires wear out quicker because of that misalignment. And so that's the conversation that we're going to be having tonight: is how do you get your elders and deacons to be aligned as two major components? And the word deacons in our day and age, um, there's a lot of churches that don't have official deacons by that title anymore, like the churches that we grew up in, Jim.
Oh, yeah.
But many people, many churches still have churches serving in the role of deacon, if even if they don't have the
Right.
title of deacon. But
Right.
we churches in our region, 505 churches in the Waypoint footprint, and many of them still have a very old structure of leadership, even with a board, where with voting uh, in a traditional board setting. And then we've got newer churches that have a different model of leadership polity. And but regardless of that, it's the idea of how we get these two groups of people, the official elders and the other key leaders in the church, working together and not pulling each other and fighting with each other and going into misalignment. So, Jim, thanks for joining us tonight. Before we jump
Glad
in, I
to.
want to remind the folks that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if you've got a question that you'd like to ask Jim, go ahead and type it right when you think it. Hit the Q&A button, not the chat button, but the Q&A button. And it shows up on a queue over on the side of my screen here. And hopefully we can get to it at the end of the session. If we run out of time for some reason or don't get to answer it, we do have the opportunity to answer it after the fact via
Mhm.
email. But we'd love for you to ask the
Yeah.
questions that we can have line up, and I'll try and either answer them somewhere in the middle of the session if there's an opportunity for me to break in and ask it, or at the end. But Dr. Jim Estep, Jim, you'll have to tell us all your roles right now, but for our purposes, you're with E2 Effective Elders, but in your leadership role in the educational world, I can really respect. But part of that is that you too, I know, are a lover of our family of churches, the Restoration Movement,
Absolutely.
and the way that we conceive of doing elders, generally
Hmm.
speaking, in churches. And so that's why E2 Elders was started in the first place all those
Hmm.
years ago.
Absolutely.
Was guys like you and Dave Rokup and Gary Johnson saying we've got to resource our elders better and well for the churches that we serve. And the Restoration Movement has kind of a way about trying to lead our churches. And you guys
Hmm.
have done a tremendous job over how many years now? Is it? It's more than 10, 15 years,
About 13,
13
13,
years,
14 years. Yeah.
and filled an absence, a void that did not exist prior, a vacuum of leadership, of equipping elders. And so thanks for your leadership there and the vision to put that team together with the other two guys and what that means now for our movement of churches. But I'll let you jump in and lead your session. But tell us your role first, just so our
Sure.
whether they're live or will be viewing after the fact, kind of know what your roles plural are. I know you've got several hats that you wear, but then go ahead and dive into your stuff.
Yeah, I'm one of the co-founders of E2, and by the way, it is a pleasure to be here. It's my honor to be here tonight with all of you, and have been waiting for this for some time, and just very thankful that Tim gave me the call to uh, come on board and do the webinar. But I am the dean of the Lincoln Christian Institute. I'll tell you what, I can show you the slide on that a little bit later. But the institute is part of Lincoln Christian University, where I'm also the professor of educational ministries and leadership. And the institute is really advanced church relations. It's bringing to the local church college level, seminary level training, instruction, seminars, workshops, and thoroughly have enjoyed doing that for about the last year and a half. I'm also been for the past 6 years an adjunct professor with Dallas Theological Seminary out of Texas. And really for the last 14 years, I've also been with Johnson University. I teach one course for them in their doctoral program. So I'm kind of all over the place. Feel like a pastoral Johnny Cash. I've
Mhm.
been everywhere. So and in fact, even E2, it was founded actually on a coffee break in Austria. The three of us were on a mission trip. We arrived at three separate times, knew each other, but had never worked together. And during a coffee break, started discussing what the churches back in the States could benefit from. And we all sat there pooling our experience, saying, elders need resources. Elders need a sense of training and instruction and equipping. And all of a sudden, that's where E2 was born, was over a cup of coffee in Austria. And we're going to be looking at elder and deacon roles and structures. And by the way, before I forget, in all sincerity, if you're trying to take notes, I'll do you a favor. I'm going to put my email up at the very, very end. And if you want a copy of the PowerPoint, I will be more than happy to email you a copy of the PowerPoint. I know it'll be available, the video will be available on YouTube, but
Yeah.
at the same time, your own copy to use, and it has all my contact information. So if you said, hey, I really wish we could talk to somebody about all this, feel free to make contact with me afterwards. Um, but just, I'm part of Lincoln Christian Institute, and I've already described what that does. But we're going to talk about the role and function of elders and deacons. That's the first part of our seminar. Then we'll be talking about the structure of them. But if I were to do this, if I were to show up and simply ask, if I observed elders at your church, what would be the job description? If we were to press pause here and give you just a moment to reflect and think, if I were to show up to your church, have a little tablet in my hand, and just take some notes. I saw elders and deacons doing this, and then later went and looked at those notes. What conclusions might I draw as to the role of an elder or deacon? And as you start doing that, you might go, oh, well, what you probably observe may be very, very engaged and active. Or it could be, well, they're probably doing routine work, serving at the table, uh, doing a ministry with the Sunday school class or small groups, or they're at the welcome table, etc. In other words, the bottom line is, what would I see that would let me know what elders are supposed to do, what deacons are supposed to do? And so as we look at that, just to know, where do we get our idea of the elder and deacon role? Well, tell me something. I mean, you really can on the webinar, I understand, but you guys, put that question or that chat up there. Anybody ever play with these toys growing up? I mean, I thoroughly enjoy it. When I had kids, I immediately started getting them Lego, and now I've got grandkids and they love Lego. And the thing is, when you play with Lego and Tinker Toys and Lincoln Logs, they really did all come with instructions. I mean, they would tell you how this is supposed to work, how it's supposed to fit together. If you have to get glue, you're probably not using it right.
Mhm.
And so I just kind of sit here going, all of these came with instructions, but so many times we chose to do what?
Just wing it.
Wing it. Um, who needs to be held back by instructions?
Mhm.
And the problem is, you know what? As believers, as Christians, we have an instruction book. I mean, Scripture does give us not a complete portrait of what elders and deacons do, but they at least give us, at least the pages of Scripture at least give us some principles and some indicators, some points that we can connect the dots with. So really, the question remains: are we going to follow those instructions or not? Because the simple fact is, as we look at scripture, as you examine the American church, if I showed up and observed, I can actually think of two other entities we follow equally, if not sometimes in some cases, unfortunately, a little bit more than scripture in setting up church government. Number one, we look at the United States government. I've actually had people explain to me we have elders, deacons, and ministers because the federal government has what? Three branches. And there should be a separation of powers. I'm not sure Paul was thinking about that. I'm not sure that was his rationale. Offices with stated terms, and you have to, run for reelection. Parliamentary procedures with Robert's Rules of Order. By the way, I actually did a survey and I asked a lot of churches, when do you vote on new elders and deacons? And I asked them to write it down. I was in a large group and I've done this numerous times. And I said, I would just like to suggest that you all pick November. And people would sit there bug eyed. And I'd go, and I'd even bet it's one of the first Sundays in November. How did you know? Because we elect people to the federal government when? The first Tuesday in November, just like Paul intended. And I'm like, that we got all of those procedures, all of those policies, how we even run the meetings by mimicking the federal government. And another element that has a heavy influence on how we think about church leadership is the American corporation, corporate America. Really, when the Gilded Age came along, post Civil War, and businesses began to boom, this is when you start having a lot of millionaires and even back then billionaires, which was unheard of. We started basically following, well, these business practices obviously are successful for organizations. Why don't we just bring them right into the church? Peter Drucker, we talked about using Drucker a lot. I remember that. Father of modern management, trickle down theory. And by the way, vertical positional authority gave way to hierarchical authority. Hierarchical authority with committees and subcommittees and votes and Robert's Rules of Order. Oh, and by the way, bylaws, annual meetings. Now, by the way, these things are not in and of themselves negative. But when they begin to supplant the purpose of leadership, the role of leadership, the function of leadership as described in the New Testament, then it poses a problem. You see, that's when we're starting to follow a different set of instructions to the point that it's no longer, as you put it, the car is out of a line. Doesn't mean it can't be steered, but when a car's out of a line, you have to really give it some extra power to keep it straight. And when it hits the skids, when something goes wrong, all of a sudden that tire blows or it starts going off in the wrong direction. The point being here, it created a problem. And the problem was, first off, we are very independent congregations, meaning everybody was kind of left to themselves to figure it out. Number two, ill-defined role of minister, pastor, teacher, or preacher, whoever that was, whatever title we're going to give the individual, we really can't figure out what to do with them on the org chart. Confusing relationship of elders, deacons, and staff. Not to mention just multiple structures and functions of elders and deacons. We're not exactly sure how those two connect, how they align. And so I've seen some systems where if the deacons outnumber the elders, well, the deacons are actually capable of outvoting. If you use a voting system, if you're in a board system, you create an environment where the deacons can overturn the elders. And I've had people go, now, Jim, have you ever actually seen that happen? I lived through it.
Yeah, I did too. Same deal.
I mean, it's not facetious. It does happen. And by the way, just a note, I understand there are references to elders and deacons in the Bible that have qualifications, but I want us to kind of look beyond the qualification to the role and just a universal description of these items. When you say somebody is a leader of anything, any capacity, there are five elements for anybody who's in a leadership position in the church. And I made sure I went to Bible college in the 80s. So I made sure all the points started with the same letter. So that way it has to be right. Okay. Number one, calling. Once again, yes, you have to desire the office, but then Peter comes along and says, do it out of a pure motive, do it not out of selfish gain, but because it's what God wants you to do. Do you have a heart that feels called by God to serve as a leader in the congregation? Because that's the big, we talk about alignment. Are you aligned with God's calling for this? Or is this something you want to do? It's about you, some kind of fulfillment you feel you need. In other words, make sure the calling is clear. Second, character. Uh, do I really reflect the character of a church leader as described in the qualifications? When somebody sees me, is my reputation one that promotes the faith or causes people to step back and go, wait a second? Competency. Do I have the necessary skills? Now, this is rather important. We do have to have skills to be a good leader. We have to be capable of doing certain, tasks. Chemistry. Do I know how to build a team? Do I get along with people? Is this something that my presence seems to be one of peacemaking? Now, by the way, that doesn't mean everybody just loves me. That doesn't mean you're just you're liked by all. You'll always have. I mean, anytime you try to make change, there's going to be opposition. Anytime you're dealing with a difficult situation, there's going to be alternative opinions. But the difference is when you show up as a leader, do things get better or worse? Are you known for someone who is able to actually deal with people, or do you end up just infuriating them more? And also context. Leaders need somehow to have a context in which to serve. And so I just simply tell people if there's a generic general list that we can back up by scripture, I have a whole different presentation on these five based on scriptural examples and mandates and qualifications. The simple fact is those five elements are the core requirements for somebody being a leader in the church. Footnote, I'm not trying to make this into a commercial, but if you're familiar with E2 Effective Elders, as Tim has mentioned, we do have a website. It's simply the letter E, the number two, elders.org. We wrote four books, and just simply to see it, one is called Answer His Call, Reflect His Character, Lead His Church, and Enjoy His People. And it's the first four elements here.
Mhm.
The reason we started with those four books was because we understood an elder or a deacon had to be a leader, and leaders who are Christian have these four elements.
Yeah, we've had several of our churches go through that as a leadership team together. Uh, and I got a question, Jim. I'm going to interrupt you
Please,
just so that I can
please.
find the pump if other people have other questions. But I went to a lot of churches growing up. My dad was military, so we went to a different church every 2, 3 years, and most of the churches that we went to were smaller, 80, 100, 120, something like that. And it seemed to be that there was an unwritten assumption that all leaders that were qualified to be elders should be elders. Like the bylaws didn't prescribe that you had to have this many elders, although I've been in a church that said you must have this many elders,
Yes.
which that's not biblical either. But the reverse of that was if a guy was qualified, then you basically must make him an elder. There's a unwritten assumption of that, and uh, and I just wonder your thought about that because the chemistry issue is just because a guy has a calling and character and competency, if he can't fit with the other elders or whatever leadership team
Mhm.
he's a part of, if it's on an elder leadership team, that I wonder how you feel about that, because then the accusation is, oh, you're only getting people that agree with you to be on your leadership team. And so there's that fine line between getting all people that agree with me versus all the people that align with me.
Right.
And one sounds negative and one sounds positive. So I'm curious just your thought about that whole chemistry and the
Mhm.
number of leaders and all that.
That's a question I run into a lot, a great deal. First off, just a couple things. For the quality of a person overrides the necessity for quantity. I've seen bylaws that say there must be 8 elders, and in fact, E2 even gets phone calls where they ask the question, we're running out of elders and we're supposed to have 8. We're down to 7. We got to find somebody. How do we get one? And oftentimes it's a rural congregation, and you can't really plant winter wheat and hope to get a crop of elder candidates in a matter of a few months.
Mm,
And so really, I've always tried to remove from any handbook, policy manual, bylaw, a numerical requirement. So the quality is obviously more important. But the idea that we just simply promote to the office automatically somehow anybody that is identified as qualified, first off, it does say person has to desire the office. Can't exactly just assume they're going to be an elder or deacon. And also, there comes a point where you can have too many chiefs and not enough Indians, so to speak. That's an old phrase we used to use.
mhm.
The simple fact is, I mean, I've actually talked to a church that has 35 people, and they have 7 elders and 5 deacons. And I'm like, that's a huge part of your church. I mean, that's almost half when you take away the kids.
Yeah.
And so the simple fact is, you need a leadership team that has the right size to allow it to function well. Now, that might sound very generic, but let me give an illustration. There's a business manual that says you look up dictionary. You can actually look up like leadership, and there's page after page of definitions of leadership. Look up management, page after page of management definitions. Look up administration. It's one sentence. It says the appropriate amount of leadership to fulfill to maintain the organization in its fulfillment of its mission. So administration is kind of the balance of leadership and management to the extent that it facilitates fulfilling the mission. It doesn't bog it down.
All right. Yeah.
It doesn't bog it down. And think about something. When Christ described his church, and when Paul wrote about the church, and Peter wrote about the church, organisms are highly structured elements, but they don't have extra stuff. Like recently, we always think the appendix does nothing, and recently doctors found out it actually does. So it isn't just an unnecessary, element in your body. No, the simple fact is everything in your body has a purpose of keeping the body healthy. So my point is, if you begin to realize your leadership is so big that it's slowing down decision making, slowing down the ability to implement change, creates becomes almost a council instead of a leadership team. I had one church say, but shouldn't it be representative of the entire congregation? And I think I shocked him. I said, it is not the U.S. Congress. You're getting that idea from the congressional idea. We have to have representation from all the families. No, that's nowhere in the New Testament. So I don't think there's any kind of specific number, but as few people as is necessary to maintain and advance the mission
All right.
would be a general principle.
All right. Thanks. And that
All
reminder,
right.
if anybody has a Q&A, go ahead and hit your question button and type it in, and we'll see if we can get to it. But let's keep moving on.
Now, somebody said, well, Jim, that's great, but what does an elder actually do? Well, in one word, they lead. By the way, elders and deacons are both servant leaders, but there's a difference, and we're going to get to that in just a little bit. But they lead, and when you read, for example, the book of Acts, as well as the rest of the New Testament, 5 elements pop up. These 5 pieces are the core, if you will, position description, job description, function of an elder. First off, they pray. I mean, when Paul went to meet with the Ephesian elders, they prayed. Timothy talks about praying with elders. They protect. Their job is to protect the congregation. The elders, even like I said, the Ephesians even protected Paul. And by the way, what did Paul say to them? Guard the sheep, guard the flock. By the way, they also preach and teach. But all these are going to start with the letter P.
I, I was
Preach and
I was
teach.
hoping, yeah, I was.
That's right. Yeah, they have to. That
Yeah.
way we know it's right. Okay. But they preach and they teach. By way of all the elder qualifications, when you really hear about functions, what they have to be able to do, what kind of skill do they have to have, able to teach. Everything else is about them being or about their family. But what do they have to be able to actually do? Well, for the congregation, they have to be able to teach. Because by the way, if you these are kind of like a Venn diagram, they overlap. If you can't teach, how do you protect against false doctrine? If you can't teach or preach, how do you promote sound doctrine? So these things kind of go together. By the way, they set policy. Look at Acts chapter 15. Huge debate, huge issue. Um, can Gentiles enter the church without first becoming Jewish? Shouldn't they have to accept the law of Moses? Jesus was a Jewish Messiah, and Paul, you went to a bunch of Gentiles and let them right into the church without them first accepting the old covenant. And after, I mean, what must have been a long debate, because when you read Acts chapter 15, not only is it one of the longest chapters, but it's like, and then this group spoke, and then that group spoke, and then this person spoke. And with many words, they did this. And you're in trouble when, Paul or when Luke decides just to put etc. And he keeps going. And at the end, they say, hey, what if we wrote a letter to all the churches, which, by the way, the Greek word there is dogma, which simply means decree. It gets translated letter, dogma, decree. But let's just write down something that says this is our decision and circulate it to the churches. It's a policy. That's what they do. By the way, I don't want to open up a can of worms, but what is one of the big issues churches are facing right now and have for about the past 10 years? What happens when 2 people approach you to get married at your church and it's, Bob and Larry? Well, I hope you'd have a policy that is biblically based, legally sound, that the church has already thought through. By the way, policy is a means of protecting and something you can teach with that says we're trying to protect our congregation. We're also trying to guide our staff so they're not left going, well, I have to find out what I can do and what I can't do. Or how am I supposed to approach this? And not to mention the fact pastoral care, the shepherd the flock. Even one of the words we use to describe that role is shepherd. Now, this is what an elder is supposed to do. Now, I'm not being facetious, but if I were to look at your elder agenda, like when you show up for your elders meeting, if it says, well, we're going to be discussing a new transmission for the lawnmower, well, we're going to be talking about the color carpet in the worship center. Well, we're going to talk about, I can't figure out where that fits into any of this. I really can't figure that out.
You're not being facetious at all. And so
I mean, I can't, but and little footnote, I'm watching our time, but little
yeah,
footnote, John Adams really in America, okay, I'll use American illustrations. John Adams really, really, really wanted American independence. He championed it. And yet he was frustrated at the Continental Congress's absolutely, just slow pace toward it. And at one point, they actually captured it in the musical 1776. They capture it in this music when the person in charge of like running the meetings went up and got him out of a bell tower and said, Rhode Island has a very important vote, and they didn't want to make the vote without you being present. Well, what issue is being discussed? Well, General Washington's request that all members of the Rhode Island militia wear matching uniforms. And John Adams just about lost it because he was like, why are we, the Congress, getting uniforms? What, I mean, are there not bigger issues to be handled? And here's the point. When elders get stuck in the weeds, they're not paying attention to the big items,
Yeah.
or they're having to have 6-hour elder meetings to get everything in. And by the way, try to recruit somebody to be a new elder when you get to look at them and say, one of those job description things, one of those observations a guest would have is we started a meeting at 6 o'clock on Thursday and get done till 1 in the morning on Friday. See what I'm saying? Now,
Yeah.
by the way, people go, well, that's what an elder does. What about a deacon? Well, the core word deacon literally meant diakonos, serve. So it's still a servant leader, but the whole focus is their focus really is on the serve aspect because they take care of immediate needs. Paul needs to deliver a letter to the church at Rome, and he appoints a deacon to deliver it. Which, by the way, also means sometimes it's temporary. We appoint you a deacon to handle this issue. Once it's done, what? Finished. Take care of community needs. We're noticing some needs beyond the walls of our church. While we serve the congregation and the community, we're noticing needs both inside and outside. Who can we put in responsible positions to do this? Who can use their giftedness in this area to do it effectively and to lead these tactical ministries? This is one of those cases where I really wish I could see Ray's face. My father, who's been departed for some years, um, I was the first one to start going to church in my family, followed by him several weeks later. Shocked everybody growing up. He had been a bootlegger when he was younger, and his nickname was Turk for Wild Turkey Whiskey. And so, I mean, when I talk, he was the most unlikely person to join a church. People thought he was joking when he went back to his class reunion, in part because they couldn't believe he became a believer, but also because he didn't graduate. He would still show up to the class he should have been with. Um, but I bring this up because they approached him to become a deacon years later, and he went, well, what could I possibly do? James, you know cars. You know vehicles inside and out. We have a whole fleet of vans and cars that our youth use, our staff uses, and nobody's taking care of them. Sometimes we show up and they're not maintenance, they're out of gas, well, I can do that. And all of a sudden, my dad was over the fleet and he loved it. He was using his giftedness, his natural desire and angst to work with vehicles for the cause of the kingdom. And he loved it. And that's what he did faithfully until his health began to fail. Now, I kind of have to put a little bit of a pin in it to move to the next part of our seminar, because if you go, yeah, but Jim, how do those two wheels align? How do you keep, the elders really providing that oversight and the deacons doing individual ministries? Very good point, because we all watched, I hope, a game last night. And since my wife is from Missouri, I knew who I had to be rooting for, and that's Taylor Swift. Okay, but the simple fact is, where do we serve in relation to one another? Well, just a couple of notes here. In the New Testament, we have a couple of actual portraits, and they're not all clear. For example, early on, Acts chapters 1 through 5, it's just the apostles. There's not a mention of anybody else but them doing everything. In fact, if there was an org chart of the Church of Jerusalem, it would just be what? apostles, 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 apostles. You then find apostles and a group called the seven who are described as serving. And that's really in Acts chapter 6. And even later, one of them is bumped into, and he's described as Philip, who was one of the seven. Then you get apostles, and as Peter's traveling around in his missionary journeys, Acts 13 and beyond, they're appointing elders over all the city churches. And then you read about elders in, for example, Acts and Titus. And then you get elders and deacons in Philippians and First Timothy. By the way, little footnote, I am trying to write a book. I've been trying for a number of years on Philippians as a Bible study for elder teams and deacon teams, because it's the only book in the entire New Testament addressed to elders and deacons. It actually says to all the saints in Philippi and the overseers and deacons. And if I'd been an elder or deacon sitting in those congregations when that letter arrived, I would have been like a meerkat going, what's he going to say to us? And so it has a very distinctive message to all believers. But if I'm an elder or deacon, I'm a leader in the church. There's some, when you say Timothy, who puts the needs of others before himself, as an elder or deacon, that takes on a whole new application. So I'm hoping to have that done within the year. I've been working on it. I've got several chapters done. So I'm hoping it's a good Bible study and it'll be released later in 2024.
All right. We'll be looking for it.
But what about the evangelist, the minister? Well, here's where it gets funny. And I promise I'm not going to do a restoration history class tonight, but here's very simple. Alexander Campbell had a strong anti-clerical streak. And he said you ought to have bishops, deacons, and an evangelist. And by the way, he actually said if the church was a school, the elders, the bishops, are the faculty. They preach on Sunday morning, they teach on Sunday morning. The deacons are the staff, and the evangelist is the recruiter. He's out there evangelizing, but the minute they become a Christian, they're under the bishops, under the elders teaching and preaching. Okay. Well, here's the fun part. Stone said, actually, we ought to appoint a pastor, kind of like a ruling elder among the other elders. And that person is the one responsible to serve. He's kind of the elder worthy of double honor, who preaches and teaches and receives financial compensation for it because he does it as his role for the church. And you kind of have a ruling elder, but then among the other elders. And then, of course, you appoint deacons. And so, honestly, in our movement, there's no, I understand, I wrote a whole chapter on this in one of our books. Why are we so confused? Because we have competing DNA. We actually have competing DNA. Our founders did not agree. And we never cleaned it up.
Hmm.
We never, even J.W. McGarvey, one of our most brilliant thinkers, he kind of sided with Campbell and he said, I don't understand why when the preacher isn't there on Sunday morning and an elder's going to speak, attendance drops. Now, Stone would have gone, I know why. And so honestly, here's the fun part where many of our churches are patterned after Stone, but try to function like Campbell.
Hmm.
And we won't drive in disalignment. So here's the point. Structures, I've actually seen these. I'm just going to put them up there quickly, but I've actually seen these in books trying to explain the structure, like handbooks of churches. You got elders, then you have elders and deacons, and then you've got a church board with elders and deacons, but what about the minister? Well, I've seen them, okay, maybe the minister is this person over here, somewhere between elders and deacons. Maybe they're like an elder ex officio, Latin for out of the office. Somebody said, what do you think of that, Jim? I'm like, I always get a little worried when you have to use Latin to explain your church structure. That's all I'm going to say. When you have to start using Latin, it gets a little scary. Now, some people go, well, the minister's a deacon or the minister, maybe, okay, maybe they're above the elders. Maybe this is the a polity that is used by some other churches and not so much in ours. But I've even seen, okay, nope, they're even over here. They're that evangelist idea. under everybody. I hate to say hireling, but a hireling. Um, and others just put ministers right on the board. Now, when I say E2 recommended structure, please hear me on this. This does not mean that we only work with you if you adopt this structure. This is not a mandate. But at some point, if I showed you all that stuff, you'd have to say, well, Jim, what do you recommend? Okay, here it is. And by the way, if you say, but we use a church board, God is bigger than any structure we can put together. He will work through whatever we do. But if we're really nicely aligned and we're structured and transmission's working well, it's going to be a lot easier to see his will and to see him work through us. So we have the elder body, and of the elders, there's that one individual who, whatever title you want to give them. At Indian Creek, I think Gary, who was an elder, used the title lead servant. But this person who is the elder worthy of double honor. And the deacons are under the elders, and the staff is under this person, and they kind of work together, the volunteers and the deacons and the church staff. And this is kind of the model that E2 recommends. Now, part of it is because of the confusion over what does deacons do. When we put deacons on church boards and all they did was say, okay, now I get a vote. By the way, many churches had to appoint a separate group of people called trustees to do the service work because the deacons became voters. And here's my point. I don't, this is extra stuff. I'm going to go quickly through it because I'm looking at our time, but it's important. In the Restoration Movement, we started talking about deacons very early on, but we brought in the definition used by the church groups we're coming out of. Alexander Campbell wrote in the Christian Baptist about deacons. Larger attention was given in the Millennial Harbinger by a guy named Milligan. I'm going to skip my personal observation. Early attention to the role of deacon focused on restoring the servant dimension. If we had time, I would say go online real quick and look up deacon and hit image, and I'll tell you what you'll find. You'll find a guy in a nice robe standing next to a priest, helping him give communion. The Restoration Movement was like, yeah, we get it. In high churches, that's what a deacon is. But when we read the Bible, they're a servant of the church, of the community. They're doing the ministry. There seems to be a confusion and diversity of opinion over things like, are they just servants, just volunteers, or are they something more than that? Are they to be ordained or not ordained? By the way, are they only male or can they be male and female? The relationship with the elders. And by the way, with the advent of church board and governmental confusion, all these questions got more and more and more confusing. Bylaws seemed to codify the confusion because all of a sudden we had to define exactly what governmental structure we were going to use. And we had to put it into bylaws. So then we had a quandary of trying to describe the relationship of elder to deacon. So early in the 20th century, we thought, okay, management and worker. Elders are the management, deacons are the workers. By the way, during World War I and later into World War II, more in World War II, we started thinking about officers and enlisted men. That's a very easy one. And by because how many millions of men and women went off to fight in World War II? Well, it made sense, officers and enlisted. But quarterback and linemen, coaches and players, the sports metaphor became a little more popular in the 60s and 70s. But one thing that did occur is a shift from understanding the church's governments from being hierarchical to being more like a team, something that was more like, a network. And we began to focus on function over position. So one thing that I could draw up here is this. A basic formula was that churches were staff guided. Now, by that, please don't think hierarchical, but who's on the ground during the week to do the work ministry all the time? Well, the staff's the one in the office, the staff, the one we called, we actually made them the elders worthy of double honor. Okay, but elder guarded, who protects not only the staff, but the congregation, works as a team with that group. Absolutely, the sounding board for the staff. Deacons gifted. My dad, yeah, he had one great gift, automobiles. And he could use that for the Lord. To do what? Grow a congregation. Notice they all start with G. Staff guided, elder guarded, deacon gifted, congregation growing. And so with that, and I'm going to put this up here. This may this may take a little bit too much time, but just as I want to note a couple of things here. This is more, instead of a hierarchy, it's flat and fluid. At the core is our authority, giving authority to execute, empowering people to do their ministry, to do their job. I don't have to get permission to do my job. I don't have to get permission. You told me what to do. You've set a policy, a procedure. I understand what I'm supposed to carry out. Let me do it. But also the responsibility for a healthy church. So it's not just handing over authority, it's authority with responsibility. And all of a sudden, you've got the preacher and the chairman of the elders, who cannot be the same person, the staff and the elders and the volunteers, who could be, and on that line between the elders and volunteers is where the deacons are. Because who's going to actually be in charge of this body of volunteers? You're going to appoint one of them to be a what? That lead volunteer. So what do elders need to do if we're going to try to do this? Is because eliminate the desire to be in the weeds. We're going to have to start delegating responsibility with authority to other people. So, I mean, I've served as an elder before, and I get it. It is really tempting to want to what? Subtly start moving toward micromanaging.
Yep.
And the point is, we have to fight that desire to get in those weeds and learn to, which means by these elders, our best job is to pour ourselves into other people to see them grow and mature and become capable, and then hand them the ball and say, run with it. By the way, the word elder, episkopos, meant overseer. And that is the most common word used in the New Testament to describe this position. Presbyteros was elder, episkopos was overseer, poime was shepherd. Episkopos is used more. And it says basically the job of the elder is to oversee, not do everything. That's the deacons. Now, how does that work? Well, what branch was your family in, Tim?
I was Air Force.
Okay, well, I'm sorry I put an aircraft carrier up there, but okay. My family's a lot of Navy, so. But the bottom line is, I've been on board one of these. Maybe some of you have been on board one. I mean, I've visited one. I did not serve, but that con tower is over to the side so that planes can land, and up in the top is where really the flight controllers, the captain, the person in charge of the flights, because they have to be able to look out and see what? The whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Stem to stern. They've got to have oversight. But what you don't realize is that little box that's now spinning, that's a truck. And if I actually had to blow it up, that, no pun intended, has missiles on it. I had to blow up the picture and it has missiles on it, and they're loading missiles onto the plane. Do you think that guy driving the Jeep has to call up to the captain of the ship and go, am I allowed to do the job you trained me and equipped me to do? And yep, it's the time to do it. I have your permission to actually do what you asked. What do you think the captain would say? Why are you bothering me with this? Of course, this is your job. See, my dad did not have to call an elder to go, hey, I know it's in my budget and it's in my oversight, but of this one small ministry, just the vehicles. But can I fill up the tank with gas? Yes, James, that's what you're supposed to do. Now, boy, if my dad said, well, the lawnmower has an engine, so that makes it part of my job. No, that's grounds. That's somebody else. Stay in your lane. He never tried that, by the way. The simple fact is this. I'm like, this is where we go. It's a difference of scope. Elders and deacons are leaders, but it's a difference of scope. Here's the congregation. Elders oversee what? The whole congregation. That's why those five elements of, prayer and protect and pastoral care and preach and teach and policy, we do it for the whole church. And make sure ministries get done, we appoint deacons who have authority over what? A smaller scope, a particular ministry, a particular responsibility. And so it's the basic idea that elders lead by giving oversight to strategic operations, whereas deacons lead through tactical operations. Now, I hope that kind of makes sense of how you would divide it. Now, does that mean an elder on occasion can't lead a ministry? Of course not. It's just, once again, trying to maintain the integrity of the elder team to handle congregation-wide matters and
Right.
empower deacons to handle the matters that are more focused. By the way, in Acts chapter 6, the point I would make is, do you think the seven had to call Peter and go, hey, can you approve the menu? Hey, we have to have food for tomorrow. Can you approve another expenditure from the treasury? I seriously doubt it. I'm just going to say, because by the way, if they did that, I can just imagine Peter looking at the other 12 apostles going, I thought we did this so we weren't going to have as much paperwork, so that we could actually go back and preach. But it seems like now we're having to have meetings. And we have to have meetings for everything. Everybody has to vote. Everybody has to approve. Elders and deacons have to, as opposed to the elders govern by giving authority and responsibility to others to handle the work of the ministry.
Yeah. Well, Jim, our time is up. I would love for you to get your email there.
Sure.
There
Oh,
you
just a little
go.
note here. There's a book from E2
Yep.
available now. There's also Deacon Strong, which handles a lot of these issues. But there's my email and my phone. I
Wow.
do not have a burner. That is my actual phone. And so if you want this PowerPoint or you need to talk to me, feel free to call.
All right. Well, Jim, thanks for leading us through that. PowerPoint is huge. And we've got a place on our website down below our events of resources from webinars
Oh,
that we can put
sounds
that as
good.
a PDF version of your PowerPoint. So it could be found as there as well. Terry Sweeney is given us a question that we don't have time for, but Jim, I'll send it to you via email for you to
Please.
address. It's a great question. And I want to leave you all with the way that Waypoint would love to serve you and your church, uh, completely addressed by what Jim has shared with us tonight. A couple of things. There are webinars that are on the YouTube channel about what effective elder meetings look like. One about the role of elders that Dr. Gary Johnson did early on. But also one of the services that we provide to churches for a fee is what we call the OSR report for elders. And we will watch your elders meetings, 3 elders meetings in a row via Zoom, and then generate a report, OSR, observations, suggestions, and recommendations. And and I was just at a church yesterday where I'd helped their church's leaders about their elder meetings, because I went in and attended their elders meetings, and they were very long, 3-4 hours long, and they were deaking the whole meeting. A 3-hour meeting was 2 hours of deacon, 1 hour of elding. And so I was with the preacher yesterday, and he had an elders meeting, and he said, "We've done what you told us. Our elders meetings are 59 minutes." And I challenged them to kind of map out, if you only had 59 minutes, what would you do in your meeting, and what would you eliminate? And it's revolutionized their meetings. And so to get some outside perspective, we'd love to come in and do that and serve your church, because when your leaders are aligned and fully equipped to do their job, the church can grow. So thanks for your time tonight. We're really thankful for Jim and providing us with this level of teaching and some background historically and theologically. And we hope that your church thrives and your leadership thrives because of your alignment as leaders in the church. So thanks for your time tonight. Jim, thanks for joining us. And I hope many of the people that view this webinar get to connect with you and help their church become
Absolutely. Glad
their
to do it.
All right. Have a great night, folks.